The summer of 1978 at Lake Tahoe felt like any other until it became a living nightmare. The Carson family had just captured what should have been a perfect vacation snapshot. 8-year-old Jacob, wearing a bright red cap stitched inside with Jake Carson, stood at the water's edge, feeding ducks, his innocent grin shining under the sun. In the next heartbeat, he vanished among the crowds and pines. No trace, no cry for help. That single red cap, stamped with his name, lay on the pebbled shore like a ghost, and suddenly a little boy was gone. Through the next days, police and volunteers combed every inch of the lakeshore, calling his name again and again. But all they found were footprints that mysteriously appeared and vanished in the forest. The story slipped into rumor for 25 years, until one brutal winter storm in 2003 unearthed that same red cap, frozen beneath heavy drifts of snow. In a moment of shocking revelation, a mother's decades-long agony ignited a final spark of hope. And in the howling wind of that blizzard, a 25-year-old mystery flared back to life, exposing a mother's unbreakable grief and the faintest glimmer of peace. Midsummer 1978. The air around Lake Tahoe was so clear that you could see the place where the granite peak of Mount Talek met the cobalt sky. Pines loomed on the horizon, their needles whispering a hush across the placid water. A soft breeze carried the scent of sap and blooming wildflowers. For Linda and Michael Carson, it had all been too long in planning. They'd loaded up their wood-paneled station wagon at dawn in Sacramento, chasing sunrise as they wound north. Their 2 children, 8-year-old Jacob, everyone called him Jake, and 2-year-old Emma, had clutched road trip snacks and squirmed with excitement in the back seat. They arrived at White Wave Cove just after 10 o'clock a.m. The lake was still calm, mirroring the sky so exactly it seemed like a portal to another world. Linda hopped out, stretched, and drank in the view. Towering pines stretched right to the shore. Pebbles glistened beneath a foot of crystal-clear water, and a few early campers were setting up tin can cookers to boil water. Michael steered the station wagon into a small clearing, parked, and popped the trunk. They hauled out coolers, beach towels, and a Polaroid camera that had belonged to Linda's father. Jake vaulted out of the back seat first, chasing after a flock of mallard ducks gliding just a few feet offshore. He wore a bright red baseball cap, the kind every boy had in 1978. But inside the brim, Linda had carefully stitched Jacob C. in black embroidery thread. She didn't want him to get lost. Emma toddled behind him, her tiny denim overalls peeking out beneath her fluffy sweatshirt. She clapped her hands whenever she saw a duck quack, and her squeals of delight carried across the rocks. "Careful, sweetheart," Linda called to Emma as she knelt by the water to remove her sandals. Michael had already set up their small canvas cabin and pitched a sleeping bag. There was an air compressor for the inflatable kayak they planned to use later, and a propane cook stove. It all felt like a promise. A week by the water, no work, no worries, just the laughter of 2 kids and the rustle of pine boughs. The Polaroid went to Linda as soon as she set her things down. She focused on Jake at the edge of the water, the sunlight on his face making his freckles sparkle. She lined up the shot. Jake's face brimmed with wonder as he held out bits of torn bread to the ducks, and Emma watched from behind a driftwood log, clapping her hands. "Snap." "Perfect," Linda murmured, then placed the instant print on a flat rock to dry. Michael leaned against the cabin's frame, nodded approvingly, and said to Linda, "Let's let them play for a bit. I'll get the kayak inflated, and we can tow them out on the lake in an hour or so." She agreed and sat back on a low boulder, sipping iced tea from a thermos. That moment, kids safe, sun smiling, water glistening, felt like a gift. Jake continued to feed the ducks, tossing small pieces of torn white bread. The ducks hungrily quacked and flapped as tiny ripples danced across the lake. He leaned forward, elbows nearly touching the water, utterly enthralled by each flash of white wing and each splash in the shallows. Emma crouched beside him to watch, occasionally reaching to pass him another scrap of bread. By 1 p.m., a few other families had arrived at White Wave Cove. There were seasonal campers with trailers, a small group of college students grabbing a quick swim, and a fishing boat anchored 200 yards offshore. The cove was busy enough to feel populated, but not so crowded that you couldn't hear the wind in the pines and the soft lap of waves. Linda heard Michael calling for her, and when she stood up, she brushed sand off her feet and walked to the shore. "Time to inflate the kayak," he said, smiling. She took Emma's hand. "Okay, kiddo, help me with your brother soon." But as she turned to look for Jake, he was already moving along the water's edge. He didn't turn back when she called him. "Jake, come on, we'll be out on the water soon." "I'm feeding the ducks, Mom," he shouted, beaming. In that instant, Linda felt a light pang. He was farther than she expected, but she also felt confident. He was only 8, and they were all right here. She and Michael exchanged a glance. 10 more minutes, Michael said, then placed Emma in the inflatable baby float under a shade umbrella they'd set up. That 10-minute window was all it took. Michael carried Emma up to the cabin to start preparing a picnic lunch of sandwiches and fruit, and Linda kindled a small fire to keep water hot. A breeze ruffled the pines overhead. No one seemed nervous. No one expected tragedy. When Linda returned to the water after flipping a quesadilla on a small griddle, she noticed something odd. Emma was sitting alone in her child floaty, gazing out awkwardly. "Sweetheart, where's your brother?" she asked, bending to pick up a stray leaf from Emma's lap. Emma pointed. "Duck, Mama," she murmured. Linda spun around to look at Jake. He was gone. The flock of ducks paddled away in a gentle line. Between the cabins, the scattered beach chairs, and a thin gap of forest, a rent spot, his cap, had already disappeared. She gasped, hands clenching. "Jake?" she called, voice strained. Almost immediately, panic surged. She left Emma in the floaty and sprinted across the pebbles, scanning the shoreline as the echoes of her shout rebounded off the water. "Jake! Jake!" Michael emerged from the cabin, launched into a dead sprint, calling the boy's name. Emma shrieked, "Mama!" and scrambled onto Linda's lap. Within 30 seconds, people on the beach had recognized what was happening. A nearby father reached for his walkie-talkie and shouted, "Child missing, 8 years old, red cap, last seen feeding ducks." A cluster of campers dropped beach towels and rushed to the water's edge, scanning the glinting surface. Michael dashed into the tree line toward a small creek that fed the lake, while Linda clutched Emma and tried to keep moving toward the pines. But a wave of terror slammed into her chest, and she staggered. Voices rang out. "Is this his backpack? I found a scrap of his jeans by that rock." A young college student, having just wrapped up a surf lesson, was pointing to muddy footprints that terminated at the shoreline. But there was no sign of a boat, no sign of any slip. It was as if he had simply evaporated. Rangers in bright orange jackets arrived within minutes. Spotlights were set on tripods, and search boats launched from a dock half a mile upwind. Helicopters circled overhead as dusk approached. Still, no one found that small runaway boy. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountaintops, the sky turned a lavender dusk, and the first stars appeared. Lines of torchlight cut through the pines. Volunteer firefighters, local deputies, and park rangers fanned out, calling his name into the twilight hush. Dogs were brought in with search teams. The water was dragged for debris. paddles, soda cans, any sign that Jake might have slipped into the lake and drifted away. A negative rippled through the search party. No body, no toy, only one red cap on a rock, abandoned. And in that still growing dark, a single mother knelt at the water's edge, her chest heaving, tear tracks glistening on her cheeks. She whispered, as though half to herself, "Please, please let him be here." But no answer came from the lake. Only the soft, mournful calls of loons echoed across the ripples. By dawn the next morning, entire crews had mobilized. Early shift rangers in wind-stiffened jackets loaded into motorboats, shining spotlights into the lake's hidden inlets. Helicopters dipped low, their searchlights carving arcs across the water's surface. Volunteer firefighters, wearing headlamps, traipsed through undergrowth and dense thickets, speaking Jake's name into the emptiness. They checked every camping spot, every trail junction, and every sandy stretch. Search and rescue dogs sniffed for hours, tracing scents from the cabin down to the creek. Police divers plunged into the cold green depths of Lake Tahoe, tapping on submerged logs, pulling weeds, and prowling along the rocky bottom. They found a tangle of driftwood, a lost fishing pole, a few cans of soda, and no boy. The only piece of evidence they discovered that first week was a tiny scrap of blue denim, snagged on a protruding branch by the creek. Barely enough to confirm that he had stood there. Flyers had already gone up around every grocery store, post office, and gas station. Jake's face, a snapshot from 2 years earlier at Disneyland, stared down from bulletin boards. "Missing since July 14th, 1978, read the bold, red typeface. Beneath his face, "Please call if you see him. He may be scared, but he is not dangerous." The bottom half of each flyer was dog-eared from being passed hand to hand. Rumors spread almost immediately. One local claimed she saw a boy matching Jake's description hitchhiking on Highway 50 2 nights later. Another rumor said a traveling carnival worker had spotted a red cap discarded near Reno, but turned out to be a false lead, just a dirty cowboy hat. Neon signs on roadside billboards urged anyone with information to call. A hitchhiker in Carson City gave an interview to a radio station. "Geez, I swear I saw him sitting by the truck stop, munching on fries." Authorities traced that to a misunderstanding. He was a 13-year-old boy with red hair named Cody, not Jake. Aside from that, nothing. At home, Linda was a hollow shell. She attended every briefing, lined up behind every rickety podium in those early press conferences. Her voice a mix of pleading and shock. She was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. She slept for an hour at best each night, drawn to the window, listening to the loon calls and imagining they were her son's voice echoing back at her. Some nights, she pressed her face to the cold glass, whispering, "Jake, come home." But there was only silence. Michael stayed for 2 weeks, checking her into counseling sessions at the emergency department, then staying at a motel while a custodian on staff at the hospital took Emma for school drop-offs and pickups. They all ate takeout from small diners, chicken fried steak and scrambled eggs with hash browns, so that Linda wouldn't have to cook. By the end of July, Michael's shoulders had slumped. He had difficulty sleeping in his own bed with the constant memory of Jake's missing smile. He moved out of the trailer and took Emma with him to his parents' home in Reno, leaving Linda alone with faded flyers, half-burned candles, and the soft hum of her refrigerator. She refused to leave. She rejected most offers of help. "I'm fine," she'd say, though people could see the defeat in her eyes. Each time a neighbor stopped by with fresh produce or a casserole, she would hold the dish and nod. but dread settled over her like a thick blanket. She told them she needed to continue the search, that she could not give up. They looked at her with pity and admiration, pity for her loss and admiration for her determination. By 1980, Linda's routine was ritualized into a kind of devotion. She rented the same small trailer on the outskirts of South Lake Tahoe, barely big enough for a twin bed, a tiny kitchenette, and a fold-out couch. In winter, she sold hot chocolate from a small stand outside the local cafe. She wrapped herself in layers of wool and fleece as she served coffee to skiers returning from the slopes. She left behind flyers in every hotel lobby and convenience store. Every morning at 6 a.m., she'd rise and walk a quarter-mile to a public bulletin board at the gas station. She'd tear down any weathered flyers, those whose edges had curled, whose faces had faded, and replace them with crisp, fresh ones. On the drive home, she'd pull over at White Wave Cove and look out at Lake Tahoe, now a dark mirror in winter's pale light. She would peer into the ice-frosted shoreline, imagining she might see flickers of red or a flash of movement out of place. Twice a winter, during storms that dumped feet of snow, she donned snowshoes and trudged into the forest where her son might have wandered. She scanned every hollow log, checked every overturned root, and called his name into the trees. She trudged so far that rangers had to talk her back to the trailhead. They worried she would freeze or wander too far. She always cried when they brought her back, whispering, "He's here somewhere." In early summer, when storms subsided, Linda switched tactics. She set up a small camping table near the shore and answered her own phone, now unlisted, and had the line forwarded to her cell. She'd spend hours by the water, wearing the same crimson cap as Jake's, hoping some traveler might notice her, might recognize his face in her faded flyers. She offered a reward, originally $500, later doubled to $1,000, though she didn't have the money. Everyone assumed it was a bluff, but she refused to retract it. She needed that lifeline to tell herself there might still be a chance. At night, she slept on a thin cot in the trailer, Polaroids of Jake plastered on the walls above her bed. One showed him at Disneyland in 1977, grinning as he stood beside a costumed character. Another was that early morning at White Wave Cove. He was offering bread to a duck, golden light haloing his blonde hair. She'd reach for those photos, trace his face with trembling fingers, and press them to her heart. Once, in 1985, a cleanup crew dredged a shallow section of the lake near the old ski jump. They found a pair of children's shoes in the mud, tiny, white sneakers that might have been Jake's. Linda dropped her maps, sprinted out of the cafe, and raced to the shore. She was met by a diver holding one shoe. "They're not his," a forensics volunteer said. "We found no proof. In fact, we ran the serial number. They belong to a boy from Reno who lost them a week ago." The volunteer handed the shoe and walked away. Linda sank to her knees on the shore, shivering in the January cold. Another time, in 1989, she received an anonymous letter. "Your son is in Carson City. You will see him soon." The letter included a high school yearbook from 1982, with a kid circled whose face looked vaguely like Jake. The handwriting was shaky. "He's been living under the old train trestle." Linda jumped in her car at 4 a.m. and drove the winding roads to Carson City, heart pounding. She arrived at 6 a.m. to see a homeless encampment of panhandlers and broken tents. She showed flyers to a few men bundled in layers. "We saw a kid, but he ran off," one said. Kid looked about 12 or so, but not wearing the same clothes. Linda walked that neighborhood in the biting wind, scanning every alleyway and curb until she collapsed on a clutch of shopping carts, tears exploding on her cheeks. She repeated this cycle year after year, feeling a flicker of hope, racing to a ghost lead only to be crushed by emptiness. Emily, the local pastor at the Little Methodist Chapel, offered counseling sessions regularly. Linda sat across from her on a rickety chair, clutching a manila envelope of old newspaper clippings. "Just let him rest," Emily said softly. "You've done everything you can." Linda would shake her head, the envelope rattling between her fingers. "It's not enough. I can't stop." By the early 1990s, Winter's near-constant assault had taken a toll on her body. A routine doctor's visit for a nagging cough revealed early arthritis. Her knuckles cracked when she changed the old flyers in the wind. She moved slower, hobbled on icy patches, and slept with a heating pad under her arm. But she refused prescription painkillers. "If I'm not fully aware, I might miss something," she told every nurse who offered. Her social circle had dwindled. Most neighbors were families who came to Tahoe for recreation, not tragedy. A few locals whispered, "That Carson woman hates to move on." But a handful of old friends, Ranger Rick Saunders, local butcher Mike Alvarez, and diner owner Judy Collins, brought her casseroles and supported her. They reminded her to eat and to occasionally step away from the search. But Linda wasn't interested. One afternoon in 1995, she found a manila envelope taped to her trailer door. Inside was a single index card with a crude drawing of the White Wave Cove cabin and a scrawled note, "He's still here." No name, no date. She unearthed every map she had, examined them for new possibilities, but found nothing. She slept fitfully for days, haunted by that tiny drawing and wondering who had visited her trailer in the dead of night. By 1998, Linda had become a fixture at the sheriff's department. A reef of old flyers pinned to a map, a petty cash file for travel reimbursements, and a permanent seat in staff meetings when any missing child tip came in. They let her park her trailer next to the substation when snow closed roads so she wouldn't be stranded. She remained fiercely vigilant, though narrower in focus. Instead of chasing every rumor, she had zeroed in on the idea that Jake might have slipped into the lake at White Wave Cove, then been caught in an undercurrent that carried him to an underwater crevice, forever out of sight. She spent summer mornings scanning the shoreline from the same vantage point where she'd last seen him, a large granite outcrop that sat above the cove, still stained by decades of rain. She'd attach scarves, cameras, bits of string as makeshift markers and watch them for hours, hoping a small movement would change her life. She'd whisper, "Jake, I know you're here," into the wind, imagining he might answer in the splash of a wave or a flutter of feathers. But a lake doesn't speak. It just holds your secrets. Over 20 years, she lost friends. Some moved away. Others passed on to old age. Michael remarried and built a house in Reno. Emma grew up, graduated high school, moved into a small apartment, and eventually became a nurse. She'd visit her mother on weekends, bringing groceries and listening to Linda's endless recounting of what-ifs and maybes. Emma's fiancé, later husband, learned to quietly accompany Linda on her shoreline walks, carrying the shopping bags and carrying her flask of hot tea. But in every season, Linda persisted. She refused to sell her land, refused to let the little cabin at White Wave Cove go. The cost of property insurance had tripled, but she refused to move. "If I can't be here, how would I ever know if he returned?" she'd say. Even in 2001, past her early 50s, she was still going out with search and rescue teams when someone called in a fuzzy sighting of a child near the bay. Each false alarm reinforced her suspicion that Jake had never had a chance to turn back. By late fall 2002, Tahoe was transitioning to winter. Ski lodges opened up along the slopes of Emerald Bay, and tourists flocked for Thanksgiving. Linda spent as many mornings as she could at a cafe on the edge of town, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, revising flyers, her handwriting shaky from the arthritis. Each flyer read essentially the same: missing, Jacob M. Carson, age 8, red baseball cap, last seen July 14th, 1978, White Wave Cove. Call unlisted number or Tahoe County Sheriff's Office if you have any information. She updated her cell phone number to one that forwarded directly to a cheap flip phone she kept turned off except for calls from potential leads. Her daughter Emma, by then 26 and newly married to her college boyfriend, Davin, offered to take her mother to counseling or to move back into her own house. "Mom, I'll have 2 kids soon. I want you safe, not out there by yourself in the snow." Linda shook her head. "I appreciate it, baby, but I need to keep looking. It doesn't matter how cold, how tired. I can't give up." Emma hugged her tightly, then forced a smile. "Okay. But let me at least install a line-powered phone in your cabin, so you don't freeze waiting for a signal." Line-powered phone in your cabin, so you don't freeze waiting for a signal. By early February 2003, weather forecasters were already warning of the most severe Sierra storm in decades. NOAA had issued warnings of 2 to 4 feet of snow at elevations above 6,000 feet, whiteout conditions, and 40-mile-per-hour gusts. The local sheriff posted announcements: avoid driving unless absolutely necessary. Travel only with emergency supplies. Linda listened to the warning on the cafe radio that morning, shrugged, and said to herself, "No big deal. I've seen worse." She swallowed the last of her coffee and planned to continue updating flyers at dawn. Meanwhile, up in Sugar Pine Ridge, John Carter sat in a battered rocking chair beside a roaring wood stove. A single oil lamp cast a warm glow on his weathered face. Daisy, his faithful dog, lay at his feet, occasionally eyeing the swirling snow through the window. He tapped a carved walking staff on the wooden floor. He'd hunted through every inch of that forest for over 30 years, even through blizzards that left 2 feet of snow on the ground. But tonight, he felt restless. He smoothed his gray beard and retrieved a battered map that showed the old logging roads. His cabin sat about 2 miles from Lake Tahoe's northern shoreline, a place he knew as well as his own reflection. But he had an odd feeling, something he couldn't shake, a pull to revisit areas he'd long since combed. He debated putting his old hunting rifle and pack together, and finally nodded to Daisy, who got up, tail wagging faintly. He pulled on his boots, layered a flannel shirt, and pinned his parka tight. "All right, girl," he said. "Let's see what this storm is hiding." Outside, the wind had already begun to build. A half-inch of snow lay on the ground by early afternoon. John trudged down the path to his ATV and fired it up. The engine roared, cutting through the silence, and he drove toward the ridge where the logging road forked near Eagle Creek. He had hunted bears along that route for years. He knew exactly where to find deer beds, berry bushes, bear trails. But normally, he would never chance such a journey during a storm. Today, something felt different. As John climbed the ridge, the snow deepened, 2 feet, then 3, until the ATV's treads struggled to maintain traction. He brought it to a stop, shut the engine, and hopped off. Daisy trotted ahead, sniffing at each drift. John strapped his rifle across his shoulders and scrambled upward, bracing himself against the wind. Trees bent under the pressure, needles shimmering white with ice. He reached a small clearing near the bank of Eagle Creek. The waters below were mostly frozen, but a narrow sliver of running current cut through the ice. He knelt, torn between looking for tracks and checking the water's edge for fresh kills. From somewhere beneath the swirling snow, a flash of red caught his eye. He frowned. It was too bright, too artificial in the midst of white and gray. He crouched, brushing snow aside with his gloved hand. A red baseball cap emerged, crusted in ice and mud, brim folded awkwardly. He plucked it free. Mud dripped from it onto his glove as he turned it over. Under the brim, in faint black thread, he could still read, Jacob C. His breath went cold. He stared at the cap, as though it might dissolve in his hands. Memories flickered in his mind. A story a fisherman told him. Carson boy went missing. Cap found nowhere. He pulled out his battered cell phone and dialed dispatch, voice low but urgent. Tahoe County Sheriff's Office, this is John Carter. I'm at the Eagle Creek clearing, about a half-mile east of the lakeshore. I found a red cap buried in the drift. Inside, it says Jacob C. That missing boy, from 78. I need someone to come get this. The dispatcher's pause was brief. Sir, the storm is intense. What's your exact location? John gave the coordinates, then looked out at the drifting pines. He pocketed the cap, brushed a hand across his face, and squinted ahead. Somewhere, 25 years ago, a boy had vanished. Tonight, his cap had surfaced. Within an hour, 2 SUVs with flashing blue lights labored through deep drifts to John's location. Detective Ethan Ramirez, bundled in an orange parka, and a pair of deputies hopped out. They placed markers around the clearing and retrieved John's find under careful scrutiny. Ramirez examined the cap with gloved hands, tracing the faded embroidery inside the brim. Jacob C., he murmured. He raised his head to John. Are you sure this is what you found? John nodded, breath frosting in front of him. Like I said, found buried under at least 2 feet of snow. I dug around a bit, but there was nothing else. No footprints, no scrap of clothing, just this hat. Ethan gave a curt nod. We'll have to process it for any biological material and then bring it back to the trailer command post. Can you come with us, sir? John agreed, though he was clearly shaken. Daisy stuck close by his side, her fur frosting in white crystals. They drove back to the mobile command post, an insulated trailer fitted with fluorescent lights and a small kitchenette, where backup deputies had set up X-ray equipment and a laptop for logging evidence. Inside, Dr. Angela Ruiz and her team were waiting. She wore a lab coat and a crisp expression that suggested nothing escaped her notice. When Ethan handed over the cap, she nodded. We'll swab for any traces of blood, sweat, or tissue. We'll run mitochondrial DNA or any other suitable analysis. But first, we need a sample from the original bone fragment that was discovered alongside the hat. Ethan peeled open a seal on a small evidence bag and produced a second tag. Bone fragment, Eagle Creek, 2, below surface, February 15, 2003. He laid it on the table. Dr. Ruiz handled it gingerly, placing it under a portable X-ray to confirm its dimensions and assess its integrity. Yes, this looks like a juvenile tibia fragment. Let's bag that separately. We'll keep it cold and send to the main lab in Reno for full DNA analysis. A deputy handed Linda her daughter's phone. They need you up here to discuss next steps. Linda, bundled in layers and still damp from her drive through the storm, looked at the cap on the table with shock. It seemed almost impossible that it had survived buried in ice for so long. Next to it lay the bone fragment, yellowed, chipped at the edges, and the same spark of dread flared in her chest. She placed Emma's hand over her heart. Ethan came over. Linda, I'm so sorry to bring you out in this weather. But since the cap is confirmed, the next step is DNA confirmation. We need a sample from you and Emma for comparison. If it matches, we can be certain this is your son's remains. She nodded, voice trembling. Do what you need. Please, just tell me it's him. Emma's eyes were bright with tears as she pressed a tissue into her mother's hand. Dr. Ruiz led them to a small section of the trailer lined with medical supplies. She swabbed Linda's cheek, then Emma's, taking extra care. "We'll package this and send it back to our lab," she explained. Then she filled a small tube with blood from Linda's arm. Another absolute requirement. Shouldn't take more than 48 hours. Linda tried to steady herself, but the world felt as if it were spinning. She slumped into a folding chair and held a cup of hot tea a deputy offered. Emma sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her mother's tear-stained face. They inhaled the steam, a fragile comfort against the storm's harsh wind, rattling the trailer's walls. For 48 hours, Linda and Emma remained at a cabin borrowed from a local search and rescue volunteer. It was modest. 2 small bedrooms, an outdated kitchen, and a wood stove-heated living room, with couch cushions worn nearly flat. A single pot of chili simmered on the stove. They huddled there, watching the snow swirl outside and listening for updates from Dr. Ruiz via phone. Each time the phone rang, Linda's heart would leap. But when it was only a department administrative assistant checking if they needed more blankets, she'd slump back in her chair, lips pressed together until they trembled. Friends from Tahoe called to offer prayers and casseroles, but Linda waved them off. "I need a moment of peace." Emma, under her mother's frail instruction, left every door unlocked so family and deputies could come in quickly if they got news. On the second morning, the main lab in Reno finally called. Dr. Ruiz's voice came gentle but firm. "Ms. Carson, we have confirmation. The bone fragment matches your DNA with a 99.9% probability. There's no doubt. This was a fragment of your son, Jacob M. Carson." Silence roared in Linda's ears. She was kneeling by the wood stove, spoon halfway to her mouth, when she registered the words. She froze, spoon dropping to the plate with a hollow clatter. Her breath came out in a ragged gasp. Emma, standing behind her, placed her arms around her mother's neck. Through tears, Linda whispered, "He's gone." Dr. Ruiz hesitated. "I'm so sorry. We'll handle everything with full respect. I'll connect you with a local funeral home and let you know if we find anything else in the data. But yes, I'm terribly sorry." When the call ended, Linda half fell to the floor, knees buckling beneath her. Emma caught her before she hit the cold wood. They knelt there for a long time, mother and daughter together, absent of words. Overhead, wind rumbled through the eaves like a distant wail. Eventually, they rose, washed their faces, and headed out to get fresh air. The trailer door opened to a scramble of swirling snowflakes. They stood side by side on the cabin's porch steps, allowing the cold to shock them back to reality. The air felt painfully crisp, and the horizon was nothing but white. Linda pressed Emma's hand. "We have to bring him home," she said softly. Emma nodded, tears still on her cheeks. In that fierce wind, mother and daughter drew strength from one another, realizing that after 25 years, they finally had to plan the funeral. Despite the winter gloom, the next few days were busy. A local funeral home agreed to provide a small pine casket at cost, a simple child-sized box just large enough to hold a little boy's remains. A carpenter in South Lake Tahoe offered to carve a nameplate reading Jacob M. Carson, 1970 to 1978, on a plain wooden cross to mark the burial site. The family decided on a modest ceremony at White Wave Cove, the very spot where Jake vanished. "No large gatherings, please," Linda said. "Just a handful of people who were there in the early days, and those who helped find him now." Invitations were brief. A funeral for Jacob M. Carson, to be held March 1, 2003, at 9 a.m., White Wave Cove. In lieu of flowers, please consider a donation to Tahoe County Search and Rescue. They mail these simple cards out to the old list of names in Linda's notes: the park ranger who'd led the 78 search, the diver who scoured the lake bottom, a handful of neighbors, and Michael, who had been away in Reno. Michael arrived in a borrowed SUV the day before, bringing a black winter coat and a silent presence. He and Emma shared a quick, awkward hug. "I'm sorry," he said. "I wish I'd done more." Linda's face was pale. She nodded. "He's found." She didn't elaborate. Her eyes were rimmed with red from sleepless nights. On February 28, 2003, they dug a small shallow hole beside a cluster of daisies, Jake's favorite flower, choosing a patch of grass just above the lake's edge to ensure he would rest where the water could breeze across his nameplate. The hole was deep enough to hold the little pine casket, but not so deep that they could not reach it easily in winter's frozen soil. After long minutes of shoveling in near-freezing temperatures, the hole was ready. The ground was gravelly and firm beneath the topsoil. They loaded the pine box into a rented SUV and drove it slowly to the site. At 9 a.m. on March 1st, a small gathering braved the cold. Reverend Marjorie Burns, a pastor who had led the first community prayer in 1978, Ranger Rick Saunders, who had carefully logged the original search team's findings, John Carter, the one who found the cap, a few deputies from the sheriff's office, and a handful of neighbors who had donated supplies over the years. Emma stood at Linda's side, wearing a simple black coat and whimpering under a knitted scarf her mother had purchased 2 decades earlier. Michael lingered near the grave. Reverend Burns stepped forward, voice soft but clear. "We gather today to lay to rest a lost innocence, 8 precious years cut short in July of 1978. Though Jacob may have vanished in body that summer day, his spirit remained alive in the hearts of all who loved him. Today, we give him a place to rest, and we pray for comfort for his mother, Linda, and for all who search for missing children." She paused, looking at Linda, whose face was streaked with fresh tears. "Let us pray." The brisk wind carried her words across the slight crowd. Hands folded, eyes closed, everyone in that small circle felt the same ache. A child, once alive and laughing, now at peace under white drifts and a cluster of pines. After the prayer, Linda approached the casket, carrying the worn Polaroid she'd placed in a small plastic sleeve. She knelt and laid it on top, a picture of Jake at the lake, beaming at 2 white ducks. Beneath it, she set his battered red cap, perched right on the slanted lid, as if he might reach up and lift it off. She traced her fingertips over the wood grain and whispered, "My sweet boy, I love you." Emma stepped forward, placing a bouquet of daisies beside the cap. Michael stood behind them, with his shoulders slumped and eyes red, but he offered a shaky nod of permission when Linda asked if he would like to say a few words. I'm sorry, Jake," he began. He swallowed. "I wasn't here to keep you safe, but I'm glad you're finally home. I'm so proud of your mom." After a choked moment, he stepped back, his boots crunching in the gravel. Ranger Rick Saunders then placed a single wildflower, one that still grew among the pines, at the head of the casket. "For all the children lost to our forests," he said, "may we remember to return home safely." Placing several handfuls of soil onto the pine box, deputies closed the grave. The shovel hits echoed like final notes of a requiem. When the last clumps of dirt covered the lid, the ground was level and cold. Overhead, a faint ray of morning sun broke through low clouds, reflecting off the lake in a thin, silver line. The group lingered, then slowly, one by one, drifted away, leaving Linda, Emma, and Michael alone by the shore. Linda laid a white scarf over her shoulders, turned to her daughter, and wrapped an arm around her. "Let's go home." Emma nodded, tears still glistening on her lashes. They walked away together, leaving behind the cross that marked Jake's resting place. In the weeks after the funeral, Linda sold her trailer to a young couple eager to live in Tahoe. She purchased a small cedar cabin on the same stretch of shoreline, no more than 20 miles south of White Wave Cove. It was modest, 900 square feet, with a living room that boasted a wall of windows facing the lake, a tiny kitchen, a bedroom, and a loft she would convert into an office. A narrow deck wrapped around two sides, giving an unobstructed view of the water. She moved in on a cool April afternoon, accompanied by Emma and a team of local movers who carried in her few prized possessions. The vintage Polaroid camera, a framed photo of Jake at Disneyland, and the battered, now frameless red cap. She unpacked slowly, pressing each item into place. On the wall above her desk, she hung the Polaroid in a simple black frame. Next to it, she placed Jake's cap under glass, an artifact of both agony and final peace. She lit a small electric kettle, then stood on the deck, sipping tea as she gazed at the lake glistening under a light layer of morning mist. Emma visited from Reno every weekend, driving the winding roads lined with tall pines. She mostly stayed upstairs in the loft, working as a nurse at the regional hospital. But often, she and Linda would share dinner in the tiny kitchen, lentil soup or roasted vegetables, while soft piano music played. They talked less about Jake now, or when they did, it was in more practical terms, how the daisies were thriving by his gravesite, new volunteer efforts to help families of missing children, and community outreach at the County Search and Rescue Training Camp. Over the next year, Linda channeled her grief into supporting other families. Tahoe County Search and Rescue, touched by her perseverance, offered her a volunteer position as a liaison. Her job, meet new parents whose children had gone missing, help them fill out paperwork, advise on distributing flyers, and occasionally accompany them on searches. She knew firsthand the tightrope between hope and despair, and guided them gently. "Search as if you can't give up," she would say, "but live as though your day could be unpredictable." She also organized an annual Hopeful Hearts ceremony each July 14th at White Wave Cove to honor any child reported missing that year, lighting candles from dusk until nightfall, letting the flickering flames float on paper boats across the water. The event drew a small but dedicated crowd, local families, rescue volunteers, and a loose confederation of retired rangers. They shared stories, lit candles, kept vigil, not to claim a resolution, but to celebrate the idea that a community can hold on to a family's pain, sharing part of the burden. One evening in late 2003, at that first Hopeful Hearts vigil, there was a hush as the sun sank behind Mount Talek. Linda, holding a candle in each hand, knelt at the shoreline where her son's cross stood. In the circle of amber light, she told the group, "I used to pray that I'd find him alive. Now I pray I can help others find closure, whatever that may mean." Voices in the crowd nodded, some faces glistening with tears, others resolute, understanding that hope could be redefined. Summer 2004. Linda sat on her deck each morning at 6 a.m., drinking herbal tea and watching the sun dance across the water. She wore a yellow daisy hairpin, her personal tribute. A bald eagle circled overhead, and she thought of new possibilities, writing her book about the search. By fall, she approached a small regional publisher. The Red Cap, A Mother's Unbroken Vigil, was released in early 2005, fewer than 1,000 copies printed, but each sold to families coping with loss, social work students, and a few scholars of missing child cases. She never made a penny, but the process of writing had been like therapy. Winter 2005. A severe storm dumped 4 feet of snow on Tahoe. Linda rarely ventured out in such conditions. But one morning she strapped on snowshoes and trudged to the forest edge near Eagle Creek, pausing to remember the moment John Carter found the cap. She scanned the frozen creek, but nothing new showed. No new bone fragments, no lost toys, just ice and silence. Yet she felt gratitude. Because of that day, she had her answer. Spring and summer 2005 to 2006. She planted a small garden of daisies, lupines, and wild lupine near the deck. In June, she attended a local school district meeting to inaugurate a Missing Children Awareness Week, sharing her story and distributing bright yellow wristbands inscribed with "Never Give Up." Children in classrooms wore them. Teachers held minute-long silent vigils, and the story of little Jake found its way into elementary school assemblies. Fall 2007, Emma and her husband Davin welcomed their daughter Claire. Linda, with oversized arms and a trembling heart, held the baby's tiny hand and saw in her the spark of innocence that had once lit Jake's eyes. She resolved to keep Jake's memory alive in this new generation. Though Jake's case was closed, the cove and the creek remained studied territory. One late January afternoon in 2008, a group of high school friends went snowboarding near the old logging roads. One of them, a 14-year-old boy named Wyatt, fell through thin ice at a small pond and cut his leg badly. His friends flagged down a passing sheriff's SUV, and the deputies evacuated him to the hospital. When they interviewed him, he mentioned that while trying to stabilize his injured leg, he had noticed a shape wedged under the ice, like a toy or something. They returned later to retrieve the object, an old, tattered baseball cap, identical to the one Linda had framed on her wall. The boy's mother contacted Linda directly, fearing a repeat of 2003's turmoil. But when Linda and Ethan Ramirez arrived and compared the cap to the one sealed in glass, they realized it was a worn duplicate, likely lost by a teenage camper sometime in the 90s. It held no significance, but the momentary shock reminded Linda and the community how easily the past can resurface. They still place the old cap in the sheriff's evidence locker, just in case. By the summer of 2005, Linda had begun to find a fragile piece. On the 7th anniversary of Jake's disappearance, July 14th, she and Emma, now accompanied by Emma's husband and baby daughter, returned to White Wave Cove for a small family ceremony at dawn. At 5:30 a.m., they arrived while the horizon was a deep indigo. A single loon called over the mirror-calm water. They approached Jake's grave. His pine casket lay beneath a small mound of earth, with daisies blooming around it. Emma's daughter, little Claire, kneeling in the grass, placed a small cluster of daisies on the mound and clutched a tattered teddy bear Linda had bought at a second-hand shop. Just a tiny symbol of innocence. "For Uncle Jake," Claire said solemnly. Linda knelt beside her granddaughter, tears welling as she felt the familiar tug in her chest. "Good morning, my sweet boy," she whispered to the breeze. Emma placed a hand on Linda's shoulder. "He would have liked this," she said. A gentle heat rose in the sky as dawn broke over the lake, turning the water from silver to rose gold. Detective Ramirez and Tom Chloe Gwynn arrived quietly behind them, having promised to check in. They stood a respectful distance away, hands in their pockets, giving the family a private moment. Rick Saunders, a ranger now fully retired, brought a handful of wild lupin and laid them by the cross. He offered a soft nod to Linda. "He's not forgotten," he said. The entire scene was quiet, healing, and just a bit comforting. Linda could feel. As daybreak spilled across the pines, that life, though forever altered, still carried warmth. Over the next few years, Linda's life continued evolving around memory and purpose. She co-founded a small nonprofit called Echoes of Hope, dedicated to helping families of missing children by offering ride-along search training, legal resources guidance, and monthly support group meetings. She became a fixture at these gatherings, always wearing that same red cap indoors, a small tribute to her son. Spring 2008. She taught a workshop for volunteers on the fundamentals of winter rescue at the Sheriff's Department, focusing on safe traversal of snow-packed trails and identifying likely spots where victims might be found. She told them repeatedly, "Knowledge and preparation are your best hope. Time can be both friend and foe. We need to move swiftly, but with care." Fall 2009. Linda visited her new home cabin every Saturday, writing in her journal, "What if" moments, and then closing it so she could watch Lake Tahoe's waves roll in. She had begun to collect stories from families who had found closure in similar ways, compiling them into an anthology. April 2010. A local artist commissioned Linda to help design a public memorial plaque to be placed at the visitor center for Lake Tahoe. It would read, "In memory of all children who vanish from our world, may these waters whisper solace, and may this forest guard our memories." Dedicated to Jacob M. Carson, 1970 to 1978, whose red cap returned home after 25 winters. Linda stood next to the bronze plaque as it was installed on a stone pedestal near the parking lot, her reflection gilded in the sunlit bronze. She placed a small red cap in the offer trough at the monument's base. A crowd of a dozen locals, some relatives of other missing children, held a brief ceremony. A cyclist paused, dismounted, and laid a single white lily on the plaque. Then he rode off as though he had completed a pilgrimage. On the morning of July 14, 2010, 32 years to the day since Jake vanished, Linda and Emma returned to White Wave Cove for a final, quiet farewell. Emma's husband and daughter followed behind them. A hush reigned over the cove. The late spring snow was melted, and the water was a glassy haze that reflected the first pink rays of dawn. A single loon called out. It had become a tradition. Whenever they heard the loon, they felt as though Jake was greeting them. They knelt together by the grave. A single white wooden cross with Jacob M. Carson, 1970 to 1978, and a bed of daisies at its base. Emma's young daughter, 6 years old now, placed another cluster of daisies on the cross with solemn care. Claire, bright and quiet, wore a red sundress, her own little nod to Uncle Jake. She hugged a teddy bear that once belonged to her father, Emma's childhood pal, and whispered, "Hi, Uncle Jake." Linda felt a weight lift from her heart as she gazed at the cross. The wind rustled through the pines, and she could almost hear the faint echo of loons calling. She stood slowly, turned toward the lake, and inhaled deeply. The dawn had spilled across the water in pastel streaks. She felt the past and present merge in a single moment of peace. Beside her, Emma and Claire held hands. Detective Ramirez arrived quietly, kneeling to place a small jade pendant bearing Jake's initials on the cross. Chloe Nguyen flanked him, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Ranger Rick Saunders dropped a handful of lupin seeds into a small circle around the daisies to encourage new blooms each year. John Carter, now in his 70s but still hardy, approached with Daisy by his side. He reached into his coat pocket and laid a small pine cone on the grave, one he found at the exact logging road where he discovered the cap. "From the forest that held him," he whispered. A few local families of missing children joined them, forming a small circle of solidarity. Linda spoke in a voice both firm and tender. For 32 years, after several minutes, they placed their candles on a flat rock, a few feet from the shore. The groan of a distant boat motor, the gentle creak of docking kayaks, and the rustle of paddles moving across water became the only sound. The cluster of candles cast a circle of golden light, slowly melting into the pink dawn. They left in silence, a small group forging forward out of shared pain, but also carrying new purpose. Linda lingered a moment, feeling the damp grass beneath her boots, the crisp summer air in her lungs. She touched the cross one last time, whispered, "Thank you, my son," then turned and followed Emma and Claire back up the path. In the months and years that followed, Lake Tahoe remained both a place of great beauty and a symbol of profound loss. Each dawn, Linda stirred at 5:30 a.m., brewed tea, and sat on her deck staring out at the water. The cabin's windows framed a view of the lake that had once been her son's playground, now a silent witness to his life and his final rest. She kept Jake's red cap under glass on the mantelpiece, right next to a framed copy of The Red Cap, the memoir she wrote, bearing a dedication to all who search yet never find. May hope flame unextinguished. Emma and her husband, now with 2 children, Claire and baby Lucy, visited often. The kids learned early the story of Uncle Jake, how he vanished, how they searched, and how they finally laid him to rest. On warm summer days, they'd sail toy rafts in shallow lagoons near the cabin, scattering daisies around the edges. Claire would tell her little sister, "This is for Uncle Jake. He loved daisies." John Carter, long retired from hunting, started a small forest stewardship program for campsites in the Tahoe Basin. He'd lead groups of local kids, some of whom were grandchildren of families affected by missing child cases, teaching them to respect wildlife, identify animal tracks, build safe camps, and maintain trails. He always wore a laminated patch on his jacket, a red cap with JC stitched inside, a nod to the one that resolved a decades-old mystery. Daisy, old but still loyal, would trot behind him, nose to the ground. Detective Ramirez and Tamtern Nguyen remained close to the Carsons. Whenever new missing child cases surfaced, they would bring the parents to meet Linda, hoping her example of perseverance would give them courage to face uncertainty. Often, in a small conference room at the sheriff's office, Linda would sit across from a grieving mother or father, staring at their anxious faces. "I know this is hard," she would begin, "but please hold on to hope, just enough to keep going, and learn to live while you do it." In 2012, on the 30th anniversary of her book's publication, Linda held a reading at the local library. She wore a simple red blouse, the same shade as Jake's hat. A small audience gathered, mostly volunteers, social work students, and families dealing with loss. When she read the final passage, describing the moment she heard that bone fragment's DNA had matched her own, the room was silent, but for a single gasp from the back row. Afterward, an elderly woman approached. Her name was Margie Miller. She had lost her nephew in 1976 during a camping trip near Yosemite. "I never met your son," Margie said softly, "but you gave me strength to keep going for my own family. Thank you." Linda's eyes filled. "He's gone, Margie," she said, "but his story led me to help others. That's what I wanted." In 2015, a local high school math teacher, inspired by Linda's story, proposed an annual Light the Lake fundraiser. Families of missing children would gather on kayaks in the middle of Lake Tahoe, each holding a floating candle. At dusk, they would form a ring of lights, symbolizing a community that never stops searching. The first event drew about 20 paddlers. By 2017, had grown to over 100. Linda, paddling on her little inflatable kayak, wore a red cap embroidered in memory of Jake. She carried a candle at the bow of her boat, and at exactly 8 p.m., all the candles around her flickered to life, creating a ring of light on the water's surface, like a constellation come down to earth. 32 years after that single summer afternoon when Jake Carson vanished into the pines, the lake's gentle ripples still carry echoes of a red baseball cap. For Linda, the long arc of agony transformed into a life of purpose. She found peace not in forgetting, but in honoring her son's memory, through community activism, through mentoring families of missing children, and through small annual rituals that remind everyone that hope, though fragile, endures. Each morning at 6 o'clock a.m., she will still walk the shoreline, carry daisies to the edge, and whisper his name. Jake, I love you. The water will reflect the dawn sky, and for a moment she will sense him in the rush of the breeze or the soft call of a loon. She will close her eyes, breathe deeply, and continue. Because some losses redefine life, they do not end it. In Lake Tahoe's timeless beauty, the story of a little boy who vanished and a mother who never stopped searching will remain a testament to quiet courage and enduring love. And in that, they both live on, etched forever in the light that dances on the lake.